Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production of this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller-Bottimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia. Hello, and welcome to episode 256 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Have you ever wondered about empires and how they come to be? Have you ever thought about how empires are made and who makes them? Early America was full of empires. So if you've thought about empires, where they came from, and who makes them, you're in good company. Because these are questions and areas of research that interest many historians of early America, including historians like Christian Koot, a professor of history at Towson University. Now, to find answers to these questions about empire, how they're made and who makes them, Christian has researched and written 2 books about the Anglo-Dutch world of the 17th century. And during the course of his investigations, Christian wondered about the role maps have played in making empires. So today, he joins us to take us through his research into what one specific map, Augustine Herrman's 1673 map, Virginia and Maryland, and what Herrman's map reveals about empire and empire making. Now, using details from his book, A Biography of a Map in Motion, Augustine Herrman's Chesapeake, Christian reveals information about a merchant named Augustine Herrman and how he became a map maker, the 17th century world of Virginia, Maryland, and New Netherland, and details about Herrman's 1673 map, Virginia and Maryland, and what his map reveals about empire and empire making in the 17th century. But first, did you know that the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook is not only a place where you can chat about history and ask your questions about it, but that it's also a place where you can get free books? That's right, I said free books. I have free books to give away because publishers send me extra copies of the books we discuss on this podcast so that the Omohundro Institute and I can give them away to you on our Twitter feeds and in our private Facebook group. So if you aren't already a member of the Ben Franklin's World listener community, what are you waiting for? It's really easy to join the group. Visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the Join the Community button right on the homepage. That's it. It's right on the top of the sidebar, so you can't miss it. All right. Are you ready to see what an old map can tell us about 17th century empires? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is a professor of history at Towson University. His research expertise is in colonial and early modern Atlantic history and in the history of cartography. He's published numerous essays and book chapters, and 2 books: Empire at the Periphery, British Colonists, Anglo-Dutch Trade, and the Development of the British Atlantic, 1621 to 1713, and, most recently, A Biography of a Map in Motion, Augustine Herrman's Chesapeake. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Christian Koot.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you back, Christian. Now, the last time we spoke, it was in episode 161, where we investigated the different networks of trade and smuggling in the Dutch Atlantic world during the 17th and 18th centuries. And now, since that time, you've published a biography of a map maker and the map he created. So, would you tell us a bit about how you came to study Augustine Herrman and his map, which we know as Virginia and Maryland?
So my first book, as you mentioned earlier, was about Anglo-Dutch connections in the 17th century Atlantic. And one of the people I met in writing that book was this man named Augustine Herrman, who I wrote about as a merchant who moved between Dutch and English colonies. And he in many ways was a prototype border crosser in that project that was interested in the ways that these 2 empires were connected across imperial boundaries. And one of the things in doing that first project that I realized about Herrman is first that he was much more interesting than I had time to investigate. And also that in addition to being a merchant, he made one of the most famous maps of the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland, which was published in England in 1673 or 1674. And Herrman is a really fascinating early modern character. First of all, though he lived in Dutch and English colonies, he was neither Dutch nor English. He was born in Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, in about 1621 or 1622. We don't know almost anything about his youth except that his father was likely a Protestant minister. And this was a period in which Bohemia was controlled by the Spanish Habsburg Empire. And so being a Protestant minister was a dangerous thing. So his father moved to Amsterdam at some point in the 1620s. Augustine Herrman appears again not until 1644, so a young man in his 20s, but he appears in a notation as arriving in New Amsterdam, which was the Dutch colony of what became New York City in what is today Manhattan. And he was there representing an Amsterdam trading firm. So he's a young man in his 20s working for an Amsterdam trader, and he was engaged in the fur trade, which was the most important commercial activity in New Netherland. This would essentially be buying furs from Iroquois people and then trading them back across the Atlantic to the Dutch Republic. So Herrman begins working for this firm, which was Peter Gebray and Sons. And almost immediately, by the late 1640s and 1650s, Herrman begins turning up in other places as well. He turns up in New England. He turns up along the Delaware River, what the Dutch called the South River. These are fur trading settlements in what is now southern New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and what is Delaware. The Dutch had a series of fur trading forts in this region. Herrman arrives there as a trader. Pretty soon, he also shows up in the Caribbean at both English and Dutch islands. And it's clear from the court records, which is mostly what he shows up in, that Herrman is engaged in trade both for himself, for the Gebrays, as well as for the West India Company. So he's essentially turning himself into a well-connected merchant in the 1640s and 1650s. Almost immediately, he also begins finding work as a diplomat. He's used to translate in conversations between English and Dutch colonists, so clearly his language skills were evolving by the early 1650s. He also becomes a politician. He gets named to a board of advisors called the Nine Men, which was designed to advise Director General Petrus Stuyvesant, who was the Director General of New Netherland. It's a way for the West India Company, which controlled much of the trade of New Netherland, to bring in some outsiders to advise the government. So I first encountered Herrman, right, as a merchant. And as I began to learn about him, I realized that he had this incredibly well-connected set of networks that connected him from New Netherland, both to Native American communities, to the English in both Virginia and in New England, as well as in the Caribbean and along the Delaware River. And then when you combine that with the map that he made in the 1670s, I began to realize that perhaps there is a way to not just understand him as a commercial trader, but to understand a little bit more about how he imagined this region. So I began to think about how the map that he made could help us understand how one of these border crossers envisioned their trade and envisioned this Anglo-Dutch world. And that's where the project began.
Herrman seems to have crossed so many different borders. Cultural borders, economic borders, linguistic borders. Was he typical in that regard? I know New Netherland and Dutch-based merchants were known for crossing borders to establish trade. So was Herrman a typical Dutch trader, or was he exceptional in his border crossing?
Maybe I'll answer that the sort of easy way by saying both. He is exceptional, I think, in the range of his connections, though he's typical because there are a number of men like him that arrived in New Amsterdam as the representatives of Dutch firms and soon began to realize that there were opportunities for themselves. And many of those opportunities came from the growing English colonies in New England and the Chesapeake that were in many ways desperate for goods. And Dutch merchants were incredibly well placed in New Netherland to exploit those markets. They had direct connections to the Dutch Republic, and obviously geographically, New England and the Chesapeake were but a short sail away from New Netherland. So there are a number of merchants like him. One of the more written about one is a man by the name of Govert Lockerman, who was an associate of Herrman and who too traded both in Virginia and Maryland in this period, and whose family eventually would end up settling in Delaware.
So A Biography of a Map in Motion, Christian's book, is a biography of Herrman and his 1673 map, Virginia and Maryland as it is planted and inhabited. Christian, in our last Doing History series, we explored the genre of biography, and we found that biographies present the life stories of people. So what exactly is a biography of a map? And do you think we can use the genre of biography to tell the stories, or I guess life stories, if you will, of objects?
I love that question because when I started this project, I, in many ways, didn't really know how to approach this map. So I did what historians did, and I started reading. I knew almost nothing about cartography other than I liked to look at maps. And as I began to read cartographic history, what I soon realized was that early modern maps, and Virginia and Maryland particularly, are incredibly complicated documents. We tend to think of maps as singular documents. After all, they're printed pieces of paper. But in many ways, maps, unlike lots of other objects, are much more complicated. Maps tended, particularly in the 17th century, not to have just one artist or creator and not just one moment of creation. In fact, they were created by a whole range of different kinds of skilled workers, and they were created over a relatively long period of time. So when we look at an early modern map like Virginia and Maryland, to begin with, we have somebody who collected the data, who figured out where things were. They could have done that by taking measurements themselves or by looking at other maps. They then would have had to draw a map, right? They would have had to put pen in hand and put it on paper and to draw what the map looked like. But then the map would have passed to another skilled artisan, an engraver, who would have literally cut lines into a copper plate to transfer that pen and ink drawing into something that could be printed, right, and have multiple copies of. So that was another skilled artisan. And it's in fact at that moment in which maps are often transformed. They go from cartographic objects that are designed to show what things look like to become also ornamental objects. Things are added to them. Pictures of sea monsters, coats of arms of kings and queens, titles and names of places. And all those things are layered on. So when we look at a map then, what we have is a number of different collaborators that create them. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they're working independently. And we have a bunch of different kinds of information: geographic information, iconographic information, historical information. So as I looked at this map, I thought, well, how am I going to think about the different layers in this map? And it began to realize that in some ways, if we could tell the life story of the object, go from its moment of creation to its moment of consumption, and to look at the people and steps involved, we could tell that story. And in some ways, that's like the way that we tell biographies. We look at the history of people, we look at the moments in which important things happen to them, and think about the dimensions that are a part of that, the greater context, and how that informs their story. And that's what I decided to do with the map, to trace it from an idea in Herrman's head to eventually the finished map.
That's a really interesting thought, because when we think about humans, we realize that we're all individuals and therefore unique. But a map, as you said, could be printed into many different copies or many of the same copies. So I had wondered if it was possible to tell the biography of something that you can have many exact copies of.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. One of the things I got lucky in that regard in doing is that there are only 5 copies of the map that are extant, and all look relatively the same. That is, they weren't modified dramatically past what their printed and finished piece would have been. So by looking at these objects and thinking a little bit about how they were made, I somehow had a sort of easy task in that I didn't have to trace multiple different uses. While the book does think about the different ways that the map could have used, I did have at least one object that I could be pretty sure looked relatively the same.
So let's dig into the origin story of the 1673 map. We began our conversation with a look at Augustine Herrman and how he came to live in both Dutch and English America. So Christian, could you tell us more about the Anglo-Dutch colonial worlds that Herrman lived and worked in?
We often think of the rise of Atlantic economies as a story of competition, right? Of English and Dutch and French and Spanish and Portuguese colonies engaged in a sort of zero-sum game of trying to amass the most riches and resources, and they fought with one another over this space. And that narrative is surely true, right? The period is certainly framed by European competition. But when we zero in on the ground of what it was like in individual colonies, what we often find, whether those be Dutch, English, French, Spanish colonies, we find a significant level of cooperation between people from different empires. Usually this happened in spaces that were distant from metropolitan power, so on the ground in the Americas. And what we find is whenever foreign empires came together, there certainly was conflict, but there also was cooperation. And one of the key sets of that cooperation was between English and Dutch colonists in the Americas. And this makes some sense. First of all, English and Dutch people in the 17th century were bound together by a common religion, right? They were Protestant as opposed to Spanish and French Catholics. They also had relatively close cultural connections. There had been significant migration and trade between the Dutch Republic and England, beginning in the 16th and extending into the 17th century. So these are not people that were strangers to one another. So when we get to the Atlantic, what we see is that English and Dutch people who had colonies that were close to each other in North America and also intermixed in the Caribbean often worked together. And people like Herrman lived in both worlds. They moved between spaces. Herrman, for example, owned land in the 1650s in New Netherland, but he also owned land in Northampton County, Virginia, which is on the eastern shore, sort of the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. And one of the ways to sort of think about the linkages of this Anglo-Dutch world is to think about the work that archaeologists do, particularly in the Chesapeake. And there, archaeologists have found that the material remains of sites where they know Dutch people lived, the Dutch migrants to the Chesapeake, and English sites look almost identical. These people use the same ceramics, they smoke the same pipes, they live in spaces that look almost identical. And it tells us a lot about the intersection of the sort of material worlds. So one of the things that I think we need to sort of think a little bit more about, and that Herrman in this project helps reveal, is the way that on the ground, people from different empires lived often in a common colonial world as opposed to in an English world or a Dutch world.
Now, speaking of how things worked on the ground, one idea you noted in A Biography of a Map in Motion is that women were the people who undergirded the Atlantic networks of trade and information. And I wonder if you would tell us how women made the trade that men like Augustine Herrman conducted possible.
It's such a great question. And it's one of the sort of exciting, unexpected things that I found as I worked on this project. Most of the book, as far as Herrman's commercial activity, is written through court cases. Herrman left no account books behind. He does show up in some correspondence of governors and sort of official documents in that regard. But to tell his commercial story, I largely was able to tell that story by looking at court records, both in Virginia, both in Maryland, and in New Netherland and in New England as well. And one of the things that becomes clear from those court records is that Herrman spent a significant amount of time not in New Amsterdam. So he frequently traveled as he traded to New England, to the Chesapeake, and he appeared in court frequently in Virginia and in Maryland. And in order to do that, he needed somebody in New Amsterdam that could make his commerce work. And lo and behold, what we find in the Dutch court records is that his wife, a woman by the name of Jeannette Varley, appears on his behalf numerous times in New Netherland. And Jeannette Varley is a really interesting and important woman in Herrman's life, not just because she enables much of the family's economic trade, but because of the connections that she brought. So Herrman married her in 1651, so within a decade of arriving in New Amsterdam. And in many ways, this was a big step for Herrman's career because it connected him to a really prominent New Amsterdam family. Jeannette's uncle was the prominent Amsterdam merchant and West India Company director, Peter Varley. So he's a significant voice in the Dutch Republic's overseas activities. Her father, Caspar Varley, was an Amsterdam silk merchant who in 1650 had moved the family to New Netherland and established himself as an important local trader. His son, Nicholas Varley, was also a prominent merchant and also a West India Company official, and eventually would become an Herrman trading partner. So to make a long story short, this marriage brought to Herrman really important connections. And in fact, one of the most important connections that it brought Herrman was connections to his sister-in-law, one by the name of Maria Varley, who herself lived with her husband, George Hack, who was a German migrant in Northampton County, Virginia. And one of the most amazing things about Maria Varley is that she traded as an independent merchant for much of the 1650s and 1660s. That is, she's married, in theory, legally, as a married woman. Her husband is supposed to be her legal representative living in an English colony. But George Hack is a doctor who appears not interested in commerce. And it's clear from the court records that Maria is trading on her own account. And she becomes an important supplier of tobacco to New Netherland merchants like Herrman. So Herrman's marriage to Jeanette not only buys him or gets him somebody who can help manage his business at home, but it also connects him to this really important woman who's a force in the exportation of tobacco from English Virginia. We find this commonly in New Netherland, and it's sort of an interesting story because in theory, Dutch law resembled English law in limiting married women's economic activity. But in practice, many Dutch wives actively participated in commerce as agents for their husband, as partners of their husband, and if given verbal or written permission from their husbands, on their own behalf. This was especially true in New Netherland, where in many ways the sort of realities of colonial life, the fact that men were gone, that people traveled often, it meant that there was more space for women to operate. And culturally and socially, husbands were more permissive in allowing the space for women to function as traders. So in fact, there are a number of women in New Netherland that are able to find this space and help drive their own careers as well as their family's success.
Was this Dutch cultural characteristic regarding women and their ability and freedom to trade something that transferred to the English colonies too, given that there were all these Dutch traders like Herrman moving and traveling all over the place in the Chesapeake?
There's not a lot of evidence for that. We find it much more in the Dutch situation than in the Chesapeake. And I think the answer is about the urbanization of New Amsterdam and the role as commercial traders. Whereas in the Chesapeake, female planters are relatively rare. And I think that's about English law. That's about the kinds of structures that led to sort of the plantation societies that get built in the Chesapeake.
You mentioned earlier that it was tobacco that brought Augustine Herrman down to the Chesapeake. Would you tell us more about the Anglo-Dutch trade in tobacco and what the Chesapeake was like during the 17th century?
So the Chesapeake that Herrman encountered when he arrives in the middle of the 1640s and early 1650s was a region that was in the midst of really rapid transformation. The Algonquin peoples who had lived around the Chesapeake Bay and had been there when the English first arrived in Virginia in 1607 had largely been pushed away from the bay, with one of the big events being the Anglo-Powhatan Wars that are fought in the 1620s and 1630s that shift the balance of power towards the English. So native peoples still live in the Chesapeake, but they've been pushed further from the bay and further inland. And now, by the 1640s and 50s, it's English colonists who control much of the land in eastern Virginia and what will soon become Maryland. And this obviously was driven by demand for land for tobacco, which continued to expand from the 1620s into the 1630s and 40s. This is also the moment in which enslaved Africans are being introduced into Virginia and very quickly into Maryland. So we have a combination of enslaved labor and indentured labor, but certainly a shift towards enslaved labor over time as these plantations are becoming larger and are requiring a greater labor force. So what we see in the Chesapeake by the 1640s is an economy that's dominated by the production of tobacco, that's dominated by plantations that are strung along the shorelines of the Chesapeake. So if your listeners imagine the Chesapeake and imagine all of the rivers and inlets that make up the Chesapeake's largely characterized by plantations that hug the shoreline. There are almost no urbanized areas beyond Jamestown and what will soon become St. Mary's City in Maryland. And we have thus a sort of very spread out population, largely engaged in the production of tobacco. Now, Maryland was a new entrant into this environment. Maryland wasn't founded until 1634, and it had literally been carved out of Virginia. This was a colony that was designed to become a Catholic refuge, sponsored by its proprietor, who becomes Cecilius Calvert by 1634, who's the second Lord Baltimore. So Maryland's a new entrance into this world. From its beginning, Maryland is a colony that is based around tobacco, like is Virginia, but it's also a colony that's riven with disputes within it. While the leadership class was Catholic, almost all of the people who came to Maryland were Protestant. which led to religious rivalries as well as struggles between what they saw as an elite group that were tied to the Calverts and everybody else. So there are several civil wars that are fought in Maryland in the 1640s and 1650s. So this is a pretty chaotic environment. It's also an environment, however, in which people could make a lot of money through the exploitation of enslaved people and the production of tobacco. To make it even more complicated, the Dutch were also part of this world in the 1640s and 1650s. The Dutch had begun to settle along the Delaware River, what they call the South River, in what is today Delaware, as I said earlier, also eastern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey. There, they largely engaged in the fur trade with the Susquehannock and the Lenape. But when Maryland was founded, there almost immediately then was a border dispute, both between Maryland and Virginia, because Maryland had been carved out of Virginia, but as well as between Maryland and New Netherland. So this was an environment in which there were lots of different people, opportunity, but also in some ways governmental instability as well.
So it sounds like during the 1640s and 1650s that we have a lot of border problems. The borders between Maryland and Virginia weren't very clear, nor were the borders between English and Dutch America. Was it these border disputes, the ones you just mentioned, and all the lack of clarity between the colonies that gave Augustine Herrman the idea that perhaps he should create a map of Maryland and Virginia and solve a lot of these different border disputes?
Yeah, Herrman gets the idea from exactly that. He, in 1659, is sent as one of two Dutch representatives, he's appointed by Director General Stuyvesant, to travel to Maryland and to meet with Maryland's government to discuss the dispute that Maryland and Delaware are having about who controls the western bank of the Delaware River, essentially those settlements in what is now Delaware. Is this Dutch territory or is this English territory? And at that meeting, the Dutch and English representatives essentially can come to no conclusion. And there's this dramatic moment that Herrman recounts in a letter to Stuyvesant after the meeting, in which meeting with Philip Calvert, who at that time was the secretary of the colony of Maryland, Calvert and the Dutch representatives, Herrman, pull out different maps, and they put these maps on the table. And Herrman will later say that not only were none of these maps accurate, that they all differed from one another, right? So essentially, it's a moment in which cartography fails. They can't use maps to decide who actually has claim to what land, right? Where exactly the border is. So when that meeting's over, in the same letter to Stuyvesant, Herrman said that maybe one of the ways to resolve this is to make a better map. And he, in 1659, made this offer to Stuyvesant. We don't know what Stuyvesant said. It appears that he ignored that offer because within a couple of months, Lord Baltimore received the same request from Herrman. That is, Herrman wrote to Lord Baltimore and said, "You want to solve this border dispute. I think I can help you. Let me make a map for you." This wasn't just the goodwill of Herrman. He didn't want to just help out the Calvert family in Maryland, but rather Herrman sees an opportunity here. In exchange for this map, he asks for a grant of 6,000 acres in what is now Cecil County, Maryland. This is a significant grant of land. In fact, Herrman eventually is going to turn that 6,000 acres into more than 20,000 acres by the time he dies in the 1690s. But Herrman got the idea to do this from that same meeting with Philip Calvert. Philip Calvert's notes on the meeting are slightly different than Herrman's. While they largely sort of follow the same narrative about their inability to come to a resolution, Calvert also notes that he had several private conversations with Herrman in which they talk about the potential of trading from the Chesapeake Bay across the Delmarva Peninsula to the Dutch settlements along the Delaware River. And this is an attractive opportunity for Maryland because it's a period in which the tobacco trade is beginning to struggle, in which they're looking for better access to Dutch traders because Dutch traders are often able to offer more than English tobacco traders. So this is a potential for Maryland to begin to benefit a little bit better from their trade. So lo and behold, the very land that Herrman asks for in return for this map is a piece of land in which the rivers that come off of the Chesapeake Bay and the rivers that come off of the Delaware River come within several miles of one another. So essentially what Herrman did was he gained access to control of a trade route that would span the Chesapeake Bays and connect it to the Delaware River. So essentially, Herrman sees an opportunity to create a new commercial opening for him by creating this map.
That sounds pretty typical of the 17th and 18th century world, though, right? In that many diplomatic officials use their official posts to also work out some sort of lucrative personal business venture while they're sorting out diplomacy.
Yes, very much so, right? And one of the things we're going to see over the course of the 1660s, Herrman eventually will move down to what he now called Bohemia Manor, named after his homeland on what he renames the Bohemia River. And in the 1660s, he's going to become an important node in connecting Philip Calvert with Dutch New Amstel, which is the Dutch city that is now Newcastle and was the key port along the Delaware River. And Herrman is going to benefit, the Calvert family is going to benefit, as are the Dutch residents of New Amstel. And so it's this combination of sort of private initiative together with governmental authority.
Okay, so Augustine Herrman wants to draw a more accurate map of Maryland and Virginia to help these two colonies solve their border disputes. And he even went so far as to find a sponsor for this map in the Calvert family. Now, once Herrman had funding for his project, how exactly did he go about creating a more accurate map? This is a question that we need to ask Christian, and we're going to do so right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. Maps are always really interesting, aren't they? And not just because of the images they depict, mind you, but because of the purposes they're meant to serve. Now, as we just discovered, Augustine Herrman's map, Virginia, Maryland, was meant to help solve the border dispute between Virginia and Maryland, and to help the Calvert family in the process by showing what Herrman saw as Virginia, Maryland. Of course, just looking at Herrman's map is really interesting, and I have included a link in the show notes so you can see it. When you take a look at Herrman's map, you'll see that it depicts multiple American communities, which on the ground had a range of customs, cultures, and of course, languages. English and Algonquian dialects and Dutch were spoken on the ground. Now, you may have heard a little excitement in my voice, and that's because I'm a student of the Dutch language. For years, I studied Dutch to help me with my historical research. I was really curious at how the people of Albany, New York created first Dutch, then British, and finally American identities. And in order to best understand that picture, I occasionally had to read documents written in Dutch. Now, a decade ago, it was really hard to learn the Dutch language. It's not exactly a language that a lot of schools or language learning softwares offer. But now, learning Dutch is so much easier because of Babbel, the #1 language learning app in the world. Babbel offers lessons in Dutch and a whole lot of other languages. And this is great because I really think it's important to learn another language, because language is really the key to understanding more about the world, both in the past and in the present. Now, Babbel's convenient 10 to 15-minute lessons are available anytime, anywhere, on your desktop, smartphone, or your tablet. And Babbel syncs your progress across all your devices, so you can always pick up right where you left off. And right now, you can try Babbel for free. Go to Babbel.com or download the app and try it for free. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, or download the app and try it for free. Babbel, speak a new language with confidence. So Augustine Herrman convinces Lord Baltimore to give him 6,000 acres of prime Maryland land if he can produce a more accurate map of Maryland and Virginia. Christian, once Herrman has this deal in place, how does he actually go about creating his more accurate map?
This, to me, was the most interesting part of the project and the thing that I learned so much about this world in doing. So one of the first things I want to encourage your viewers to do is to Google the map, or perhaps we can put a link up that will take them to the map. Because when you look at Herrman's map, you'll notice almost immediately that it's really different from other maps of the region. And perhaps the best example and the best well-known example of that is the Smith map of Virginia, which had been produced in the first decade or second decade of the 17th century. And that was a map that was designed by the Virginia Company and Smith to sort of showcase their new colony of Virginia. And if you look at that map, one of the things you'll notice is the Chesapeake Bay is a relatively minor part of the map. In fact, most of the map is centered over the land. Smith does an incredible job in depicting Native American inhabitants. There are more than 100 villages, Algonquin villages, that are displayed on the map. He shows the sort of resources, the opportunities for trade, the landscape of Virginia. What he's not terribly interested in is water. And if you compare that with Virginia and Maryland, Herrman's map, almost immediately you'll notice that Herrman's map is centered on the bay itself, that much of the map and much of the detail of the map is centered around its edges and around the water, not on the land. And one of the things I came to realize is that what Herrman is trying to do is show his Chesapeake. And his Chesapeake was a Chesapeake that was lived on the water, that was seen not from the land, but from the water as he moved through this region as a merchant. As he traded tobacco in the region, he spent a huge amount of time in Virginia and Maryland. He would routinely buy tobacco from any number of plantations, centralize it all in one location, and then ship it back to New Amsterdam. So he lived in this region, he lived on the water and moved through it on the water. And that's reflected in the map, right? So the map focuses on the waterways. There's incredible data in the waterways themselves. Almost every inlet is full of little numbers that indicate the soundings. Those are depth, so the depth of waterways. He has shaded in sandbars in different notations to show where water is essentially deep and where one shouldn't travel. He's got what are called isobaths, which are lines of constant compass bearing. It's a navigational technique that allows you to use his map, not just to sort of picture what the Chesapeake looked like, but literally to move around it, to enter into this region. So his map is focused on the water and points of access that connect water with land. And in that way, I think one of the key goals that he had for the map was to show the Chesapeake how he experienced it. This was his world. Now, at the same time, he also wants to please Calvert. So you'll notice if you look at the map that one of the only borders on the map, for example, is along the eastern shore, and it's the border between Maryland and Virginia, and it's marked by a double line of trees. This was a huge point of dispute for much of the 1660s between Virginia and Maryland, and Calvert clearly wanted this border marked so as to be clear that this was a settled issue and that this would be the clear border. It's also clear in the map that the Dutch settlements fall within the Calvert patent, so that they too should be part of Maryland. One of the other interesting things about the map, which was pushed in many ways by Calvert, and it's partly why Calvert wanted the map in many ways helps promote Maryland. It shows Maryland like Virginia. This is a settled place. This is a place with lots of inhabitants, with counties, with towns. In fact, many of the towns on the map didn't yet exist. They sort of existed in Calvert's mind, and those are things that he, in fact, would have added to the map. So this created this vision, for Calvert anyway, of this colony that was ready to get beyond challenges of the decades before and was ready to begin to expand.
It sounds like Herrman had a lot of on-the-ground experience with the Chesapeake. And when we talked to Max Edelson in episode 186 about the creation of maps after the 7 Years' War in 1763, Max told us how map makers need surveyors on the ground. They need surveyors out in the territories to be mapped because they really need someone out there to make mathematical calculations of elevations and make all sorts of topographical observations so that the map maker has these data points that they can plot on their map. I know Max told us about the 18th century, but was this process of 18th century map making similar to Augustine Herrman's 17th century process of map making?
That's such a great question, because it allows us to see the ways that map-making techniques evolved over time and evolved between different map-making traditions. Let me start by saying we don't know exactly how Herrman made the map. There are no documents that tell us exactly how, but we can read backwards from what he created and put it together with other maps and instructions for map makers as well as for navigators to make some pretty good guesses about how he probably worked. So Herrman most likely created much of the map from the water as opposed to from the land. So instead of, as Max Edelson talked about, surveyors marking off with chains, distances, and using compasses to find angles and elevation on the land, what Herrman did was work as a navigator sailed. So navigators in the 17th century mostly navigated according to a technique called dead reckoning, which is essentially they used their compass bearing together with estimates of their speed, together with a complex of navigational data. which would have included maps. It would have included profile views of the shoreline. So what hills and important markers along the shoreline would have been as you look at the land, together with written sailing instructions about going certain distances, about where not to go. And as they did that, they largely used estimates of their speed and the compass. And this is largely probably what Herrman did. He moved along the bays of the Chesapeake, and he used estimates of his speed to make guesses about distances traveled, together with angles from compasses and with the concepts of geometry and trigonometry. By knowing a couple of angles and a side, you can draw a triangle. And that's what he would have done. He would have used a whole number of different points and estimates to create the drawing that was the map. Now, this is an incredibly labor-intensive process, and we know it took Herrman at least 10 years to make. But 10 years wouldn't actually have been enough to make this entire map of the Chesapeake. So likely what Herrman would have done is already started with a lot of this data, right? This is why he knows that those maps at the 1659 Border Conference don't look right. And this is why he knows that he can make a better map. And this is one of the great insights that I found in the process of doing the research for the book that really began to change the way I saw maps. So Herrman and many other people like him would have collected a huge amount of cartographic information as a routine part of doing their job as merchants, as navigators. They would have routinely sketched the coastline, taken soundings themselves, sketched out maps, added to existing maps. They would have added notations onto maps they had. They would have had lists of sailing directions. They probably would have exchanged these things with their associates, with the people that they did business with. And thus, they would have had this whole corpus of cartographic materials that are all now lost to us, that they would have had that were largely pen and ink drawings or pencil and paper drawings that they would have kept tucked in account books, and they would have used themselves. So when Herrman started work, he likely collected this kind of information. He already had some of it. He turned to friends and associates to get other parts of it. He would have used maps that already existed, whether they be printed or in manuscript form, and he would have put all that stuff together to draw the map that he eventually would have sent to Lord-Bottimore in London.
And what happened after Herrman drew his map of Maryland and Virginia? How did his hand-drawn map become a printed map?
Yeah, and so here is a really important moment of transformation, right? So Herrman would have sent a manuscript, and we know that he sent a draft in 1666 and eventually a final copy in 1670 to Lord-Bottimore. At that point, Lord-Bottimore very well could have added things to it. For example, those towns that didn't exist yet that he was planning for. And at that moment, Lord-Bottimore decided that he was going to make this into not just a singular manuscript map, right? So not just into a map that was pen on paper, but rather into something that could be replicated. In order to do that, he needed a series of skilled artisans. The first of those skilled artisans would have been an engraver. And the man he chose was a man by the name of William Faithorne, who himself had actually only engraved one map before this, and it was a map of London, but who was a very experienced engraver who specialized in portrait miniatures, largely of the Stuart court. And he was well connected both to Lord-Bottimore as well as to Charles II. And that way he was a pretty good choice as an engraver. So Faithorne and his assistants would have taken the manuscript map, and their goal was then to engrave it into a copper plate. And they would have done that by tracing it, and they could have done that in any number of ways, but essentially they would have transferred the design from paper onto a copper plate. And they would have done that by drawing it into wax and then using a burin, which is a metal tool that would have scraped through the wax into the copper plate itself to make delicate lines along the copper. This was an incredibly skilled thing to do. And if you look at this map, you can see how detailed and how incredible this kind of work was, the very small lines and the close collection of lines. And that was Faithorne's job, right, to turn the manuscript into a copper plate. It's at this point that probably most of the ornamental details were added. The coat of arms of Great Britain, which is at the top of the map, the coat of arms of the Calvert family, as well as the cartouche, which includes sort of a monument with two indigenous people, as well as, perhaps most distinctively, a portrait miniature of airmen, which is almost certainly imagined. That is, they didn't know what airmen looked like, but they drew what they wanted him to look like. At that point, the copper plate would have been passed to another skilled artisan who was a printer. And this is somebody who would have had a really important piece of equipment, which is a roller press, a press essentially capable of exacting great force to push a piece of paper down onto an inked copper plate to essentially push the paper into the lines to pick up the ink to produce a finished copy. They likely would have made 200 impressions of the map because economically it didn't make sense to spend the money to engrave the plate and not print as many as you could. After about 200 impressions, the plate begins to wear out and it has to be re-engraved. Since there's no second printing of the map, we can likely say that that never happened. So probably 200 of the maps were produced at the end, and they would have come off the press looking very much like the 5 remaining copies look today.
So once these 200 copies were available for purchase, where would Americans and Europeans have purchased this map? And who would have been interested in purchasing a map of Maryland and Virginia?
So here we have another sort of layer of meaning that gets added to the map. So in many ways, the engraving process adds authority to that manuscript map, right? This is a moment in which book printing is not new, but is certainly expanding in the 17th century. Engraving is becoming more common, and people are beginning to see engraved and printed texts and images in the way, in fact, that we see books, right? The sort of a handwritten book has less authority than something produced by a publisher, a bound book. And they would have thought the same thing. So the act of printing the map gave it sort of additional authority. Where it was sold and how it was sold added still another layer of authority. So we know the main map seller for the map, a man by the name of John Seller, a good name for someone who's a map seller, because John Seller in 1674 advertised in the London Gazette that he had a new map of Virginia in 4 sheets ready for sale. And this undoubtedly is Ehrman's map of Virginia and Maryland. Seller was himself an interesting character. He was trained as an instrument maker, making navigational instruments and optical instruments. So he was connected to this artisanal community, but he also was a scientist. He published in Philosophical Transactions of Royal Society, which is the new society that's being born in Restoration London for the study of science. So Seller is connected to sort of the artisanal community, but also the scientific community. He taught mathematics. He also taught navigation. He eventually published a navigational manual. So he's a man who speaks with authority about cartography and about science. And he sold the map in likely 2 locations. In fact, actually, we know in 2 locations. One of those locations was in Wapping, which was sort of along the Thames. This would have been a place where mariners did business, ships were repaired. This was a place that was very much connected to England's overseas trade. But Seller also sold the map in a shop just steps away from the Royal Exchange, right? A place of learning and commerce, and particularly luxury commerce. So the map is associated both with the navigational community, but also as an ornamental object. We don't know exactly who bought the map. We actually only know 2 of the people or groups that bought the map. One of those was the Lords of Trade. The second of those was the very famous, the diarist, politician, and naval administrator Samuel Pepys. So we have a record that both of those groups bought the map. It's in an account book that the Lords of Trade bought their map, though their copy is lost, and the Pepys map still exists in his collection at Magdalen College in Cambridge. It would make sense that Lord Baltimore had a copy of the map, obviously, and it would make sense that Charles II probably was given a copy as well. Other than that, we don't know exactly who bought the copies, but that the Lords of Trade and Pepys bought the copy tell us sort of 2 really important things. One is that the Lords of Trade, this is the group of administrators that advised the king about colonial policy in the 1660s and 1670s, that they bought the map as an instrument to help them manage the colonies. They, in fact, had a huge map collection that's goal was to help them imagine and manage the colonies. So they very much saw and would have seen the map as something that was a useful device. Pepys, on the other hand, bought the map like many of the maps that he collected, along with history books and books about science in accounts of travels around the world. He would have bought the map as a way of experiencing England's empire abroad by being able to look at this map and imagine what Virginia and Maryland would have been like. Almost a text that sort of enabled him to enjoy the fruits of England's overseas expansion. And he put it in a collection with maps of much of the world. And it sat alongside of travel narratives and histories of these places as well.
Now, when we think of maps today, many of us recognize that we have GPS and all sorts of geolocation and mapping apps and satellite imaging. So our maps are just much more accurate and detailed than anything Augustine Herrman and others could have produced in the 17th century. So, Christian, why do you think it's important that we look back on this map? Why do you think we should take the time to get to know Augustine Herrman and his map of Maryland and Virginia?
I think one of the most important things about the map is it allows us to see the two scales at which the English Empire was created and imagined, right? So on the one hand, think about the map that the Lords of Trade owned. In many ways, the map was a map of possession. The big coat of arms of Great Britain, the Calvert crest, the English names on the land. All these things work to claim this land and to say, this place is part of the English Empire, right? This is controlled and dominated by England. And in many ways, that's an important part of empire building. It was about controlling and gaining mastery over overseas territories. But if we strip away those things, what we're left with is that cartographic image of the airman's world, right? And that world is this Anglo-Dutch world that is the connections between these different places that enabled those colonies to exist. So if we see these two things together, the way that empire was built from European capitals, from metropolitan centers, and the messiness and often cross-national interactions of the ground, in some ways, the map holds those two things in tension or in suspension. And thus we can see the multiple ways that empire was created and experienced. And I think importantly, that airman can't be erased from the map, because if he's erased, then the map disappears, right? His version, even if encircled and overlaid by these symbols of authority, it still remains. And it reminds us how important individuals were on the ground in the colonies and making these empires work.
Now we should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Christian, in your opinion, what might have happened if the English conquest of New Netherland had never happened? If New Netherland had remained Dutch, how would the history of Atlantic trade in the Chesapeake be different?
So one of the things, perhaps, is that New York City would be much better prepared for climate change. As we know, the Dutch are much better at figuring out how to keep the sea away. More seriously, though, I think that one of the things that would have happened if the Dutch had remained in New Netherland after 1664 likely has more to do with the indigenous communities of North America than it does necessarily directly with European efforts to colonize. I think if the Dutch had remained and there had been another empire as a trading partner for indigenous communities along what is the interior of New York and along the Hudson River, they might have been able to hold on to territory more successfully than what would eventually happen with King Philip's War and the rest in New England. That is, a second power source would have given indigenous people a way of working between empires, kind of like the Iroquois would do later in the 18th century in finding a space between the French and British empires. But to be frank with you, I think that the conquest of New Netherland was inevitable. I think if it hadn't happened in 1664, it would happen later on. And even if it hadn't come in the 17th century, it would have come in the 18th century. New Netherland was just too much of a risk for the English Empire. That as the English Empire is expanding, they can't allow this rival empire that is able to prosper in the carrying trade from their colonies, I think they couldn't allow it to exist. And if it hadn't happened in the 17th century, it would have happened in the 18th century. Eventually, the British would have simply outnumbered and swamped New Netherland. That's together with sort of the fact that the Dutch West India Company itself went out of business in the 17th century and was never fully able to commit to New Netherland in a way that would have made it successful.
So, Christian, what are you researching and writing about now?
So I'm working on a couple of smaller projects. I have an article about a really extraordinary manuscript map of Montserrat from the same period, from the 1670s. And it's a really great map that shows this is an English island of Montserrat in the Caribbean, that shows the island not in the common planimetric view, which means that sort of top-down view we're used to seeing maps in, but rather shows the island as a series of views of the coastline that are sort of stitched together into a resemblance of the shape of Montserrat. So I'm writing about what that map tells us about the ways that English colonists imagined their island in the 17th century. And that's an article that's actually going to come out in the Winterthur portfolio in the relatively near future. And then the other project I'm working on is about borders maps in New England. I'm interested in the ways that 17th century maps of New England played with, I think is the word, the borders of New England colonies and how that fits in conceptions of borders and borderlands.
What if we have more questions about mapmaking in the 17th century or the Anglo-Dutch world of the Mid-Atlantic and Chesapeake regions? How can we get in contact with you?
If you simply search for my name, you'll find my Towson University webpage, and you can send me an email, and I'm happy to answer questions that people have.
Christian Koot, thank you so much for taking us through the Anglo-Dutch worlds of the Chesapeake and cartography during the 17th century.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
If we look closely, Augustine Herrman's 1673 map, Virginia and Maryland, reveals many details about empire and empire making during the 17th century. And one of the details we can see through Virginia and Maryland is that the English Empire was created and imagined at different scales. The first scale was imaginary. English men and English women imagined what the English Empire looked like and imagined the different lands it encompassed. As they imagined, we can see in Herrman's map that they took liberties. Maps help empires claim land, and we can see from Herrman's Virginia and Maryland that Lord Baltimore and William Faithorn imagined and claimed English-controlled territory where, on the ground, it likely didn't exist. When we look at Herrman's map, we see English place names on native spaces. We see the Calvert coat of arms placed on the landmass of Maryland. And we can see an even larger English coat of arms placed at the top of the map right in the landmass of Virginia. Now, to see the second scale of empire, we'll need to look even more closely at Herrman's map and use the historical context Christian gave us. The second scale of empire is the one Augustine Herrman lived in. The map, Virginia and Maryland, depicts Augustine Herrman's Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake Herrman lived and worked in was an Anglo-Dutch space. It was a fluid space, connected by trade, water, and some shared sense of culture. English colonists needed goods, and in the 17th century, one of the best ways to get those goods was to trade through the Dutch. This proved to be a boon for the people of the Chesapeake. Virginia and Maryland grew tobacco, and the Dutch were willing to trade generously for it, which is why Philip Calvert and Augustine Herrman hoped to forge even closer connections to the Dutch in Newcastle, Delaware. Understood from this vantage point, we can see from Augustine Herrman's map that it was individual people on the ground in the colonies who made empires. The makers of empires were merchants and traders like Herrman, and tobacco growers, like the men and women who lived along the many rivers and waterways that Herrman depicted in his map. These are the colonists who made the English and Dutch Atlantic empires of the 17th century. Now, although this isn't depicted in Augustine Herrman's map, we know from previous episodes how events played out for New Netherland in 1664 and how they would play out for Great Britain during the 1770s, which means that we know what individual colonists made, individual colonists could dismantle. In 1664, New England militiamen helped add New Netherland to the English Empire, and throughout the 1770s and early 1780s, many American colonists participated in a revolution to remove themselves from the British Empire. So, how do empires come to be? From Christian's work, we can see that they come from people. Empires exist because governments imagine them, and individuals build them. You'll find more information about Christian his book, A Biography of a Map in Motion, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/256. Don't forget, you can speak a new language with confidence by trying Babbel, the .1 language learning app, for free. Go to babbel.com or download the app and try it for free. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, or download the app and try it for free. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Kayla Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, I love maps. One of my favorite sites to search and browse around is Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. You should really check it out because it's a really cool site. It's maps.bpl.org. Now, I've seen some really fantastic maps through the Leventhal, but I'm really curious about the maps that you find interesting. So tell me about your cool maps. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production of this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller-Bottimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia.